We're in the third week of our series on the family, and that brings us to the topic of marriage. And when you get to the topic of marriage, it's always uncertain what you're going to find. I recognize in a room like this, there are people in all kinds of places in life. Some of you have been married like I have been for many, many years, and you may find yourself in a pretty good spot. I want to bring to us hope and affirmation of doing the right things, and that takes us to good places long term. Some of you are newly married and discovering, as we did early on in marriage, wow, this is a lot of work. Some things I didn't expect have happened, and some are maybe just going along, first or second decade of marriage, and the kids come along, and the career path comes along, and very, very busy. And I recognize in our church setting that a large number of folks find themselves single. Some want to be single, some are single or have become single again, divorce or death. And so what can I say that relates to marriage, that's the topic this morning, but also benefits everybody? And what I want to do this morning is, for about the first half of the message, lay out some broad principles, a biblical truth that applies to all of us, wherever we find ourselves, a single or married, about understanding marriage. We'll talk a little bit about our culture and the great shift and redefinition of marriage over the last 10, 20 years, and how we as believers ought to not only think about that, but how we ought to address that. And then the last half, or the second half of the message, I want to shift and become really sort of focus on some specific things. What are some disciplines, what are some attitudes and actions that we could put in place in our marriage that, to God willing, would lead us to a good place, that our marriage might reflect for our spouse, as God intended, His love for us. And so, with that as a background, we're going to eventually turn to Genesis 2. So if you're in a hurry to get to the text, we're going to be in both Genesis 2 this morning. We're also going to be in Colossians 3. That's where we're going to spend the lion's share of our time. But let me introduce by just telling you a couple of stories. They're funny stories, but they all relate to marriage. And any golfers in the room here? Yeah, okay, I'm not a golfer. Yeah, Rick's like, yeah, well, right. So I'm not a golfer, as I said at the last night in the 9 o'clock service this morning also. I'm not old enough to golf yet. When I get old, then I'll golf. And so as long as the knees hold out, I'll still just keep hitting the gym, and I'd rather shoot a ball this way than however you do it this way. And so that swing in itself should tell you I've never played golf. But there was the guy out golfing a Saturday around noon. He was with his foursome, and as they got around the bend, they were near the end of the course, and a funeral cortege went by on the road outside the fence. He could see that, and remarkably, he was just ready to address the ball, and he stopped, and he took off his hat, he put his hand over his heart, and he just paid homage. He paid salute to that passing funeral procession. And the three other guys with him said, "This is remarkable. We've never seen anything like this. Certainly we've never seen you have that much courtesy towards someone, respect for someone as they go by, and what's going on?" And he said, "Well, honestly, it's the least I could do. We were married for 40 years. Some of you don't golf like me. You understand church life, and so I'll tell you about the Sunday night in Kentucky, Little Baptist Church down there. And it was a rollicking kind of a service. The preacher was all fired up. The music was just going, and the place was crowded. And who should walk in the back door but Satan himself? And clothed in black and pitchfork and the smoke of hell itself trailing him in. And he came in and he walked right down the center aisle, threateningly approaching the preacher. And of course, people just began leaving and running out the door. And the preacher himself saw this coming. He thought, "This is beyond me." And so he cleared out. Everybody left the room except one grizzled old deacon sitting right on the front. And Satan just got really irritated about that. And he went over to him and said, "Do you know who I am?" "Yep." "Do you know what I can do?" "Oh, yeah." "Why aren't you afraid of me?" "I've been married to your sister for 20 years. I don't have to be afraid of you. I know everything you can do." And we approach marriage so often that way. It's a little dismissive, a little bit funny, and we joke about things that honestly we recognize can be very hurtful or painful or hit close to home. And so probably my hope is that we don't find any of us in this room in those dire circumstances about marriage. If you are in that place, talk to me afterwards. I have some referrals. I can send you to somebody. Maybe it can help you. But maybe most of us, if we're married, will find ourselves feeling somewhat like I did yesterday afternoon when I was working on that summer project. Now, I've given you a little bit of an update. Summer project at the Nichols house this year is build a deck. And I had a fabulous week. We had nice weather. I was in the evenings, and we got the old deck down. We got the footings dug, and we got the concrete poured. And so, beautiful day yesterday. I thought, this is good. I had gone to Home Depot early in the morning. I got the big timber that's going to be the post to hold the thing up. And I am sitting on ready. We are going to get this thing framed up and be good to go. And so, timber is there waiting to go. I pull down the ledger board. It's a 2x10 board right up against our house. And the old deck was held up by this, at least the front edge of the deck was. And so I pulled that off of the house, and I thought, that looks a little soft under there, the rim joist that holds up the outer walls. And so I kind of pressed, and it's like my hand went all the way through. I'm thinking, okay, well, this can't be good. And so you get a hammer and kind of knock stuff loose. And what I ended up with about 30 minutes later was about a 2-foot wide section where you can look right into my basement. And I'm like, hey, look at that. There's the washer and dryer. And I'm thinking, this probably isn't good, considering this is the outside wall, rim joist of the house, holding up the weight of the house. And it's in the kitchen, a place in the house I love very much. And so I was at a loss. And so here's how I felt. Let me just describe for you. It's about this time, in fact, yesterday, my feelings upon digging out all the rotten wood and finding that there's a 2-foot hole in the very foundation of the house where my family is and where I eat my breakfast. I felt unsure how to fix it. I felt surprised by seeing something that was a problem I didn't think would be a problem. I also was frustrated that this was going to be harder than I thought, take longer than I thought, and require much more effort than I thought. And I was a little discouraged. I don't know how to fix this. I mean, I had my plans. Here was my day, and now I'm going to get none of that done. And then I began to ask myself, how can you live with this? Would that be a good place for a window? Answer is no, that would be a really bad place for a window. The reality is, you may find yourself in your marriage relationship feeling a lot of those same emotions. Oh, this is surprising. I didn't see that coming. I'm a little frustrated about how much work this is when I thought I was just going to enjoy the progress. Or you may find yourself saying, I don't know how to fix it. You may find yourself like I was saying, well, can I just live with this? Can I just settle for this? I mean, really, how dangerous is it? So let me provide some hope for us that we can fix it. Or if you're saying life is going pretty well for us, we can strengthen what's there. Maybe like in our home's 16 years old, maybe what happened to you is that over the years, water has just sort of seeped down the side of that. There's a French door there leading out to the patio, and water, what happened is, got behind that and just rotted out on both sides. That's where those holes were, on both sides of that door. And maybe things have been let go in your relationship. Maybe you've discovered over the years some things in your relationship, and you say, you know what? It feels like it's not quite right, but I don't know how to fix it. And so let's take a look, with the help of God's Word, at fixing, strengthening, building up the relationships, the marriages that we have. The Bible presents two contrasting truths about marriage, and we're going to resonate with some of this. And when I covered this at 9 o'clock, about 8 guys started laughing until they realized what I just said, and then they had to pinch off their laugh real quick before their wife heard them. But here's what the scriptures teach. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 28. Those who marry will have trouble in this world. Oh, you guys, you see, I warned you. Hey, the Bible acknowledges the reality of two human beings with their own ideas and opinions and agendas. That's going to bring conflict from time to time. And so let's just bury the concept of happily ever after. It never even happens in fairy tales. And we're not living in fairy tale land, we're living in the real world. And so recognize, mark it down, because marriage is such a wonderful thing, that brings with it the challenges that inevitably flow from an intimate relationship that is designed to be lifelong. Those who marry will have trouble in this world. Second, competing or complementary truth is from Hebrews chapter 13, verse 4, where the scriptures say, marriage should be held in honor by all, and the marriage bed should be kept pure. So here you have the scriptures teaching, if we get married, when we get married, we will face trouble in this world. And here we have the scriptures teaching and in fact commanding that marriage should be honored. It's an honorable thing to give your word and to keep your word. It's an honorable thing to be married, and we should hold it up in high esteem. The challenge comes in our day and age, where for 20 or 30 years, accelerated in the last 10 years, there has been a culture-wide push to redefine marriage. And today we now have the full weight and force of the judiciary, of the state, and of large corporations saying, here's how you must think of marriage. Of course, I have in mind things like same-sex marriage, where men can marry men, women can marry women. There are some things coming down the road which will be even more extreme than that by ways of redefining marriage. We also have, this last 5-6 years in particular, we have the issue of gender, and some living sort of the idea that gender is something one can select. In fact, you've heard more and more that, quote, the gender assigned to you at birth. It totally gets it wrong. Gender, not assigned by a physician at birth, gender assigned by God at conception. All the physician does is take that beautiful bundle, whap them on the backside, take a look and say, male or female. The gender was already assigned. All he's doing is observing that. But we live in a world today where that is being re-examined. There's the cultural forces pushing towards sort of a practical, pragmatic, if you want to be male, you can be female. It doesn't matter the anatomy. You want to be female, you can call yourself female. It doesn't matter the anatomy. What do we as Christians, talking about marriage, what do we do about that? What do we think and feel about that? I would say this, culture-wise, as far as the culture goes, those decisions, those battles largely have been fought, and largely they've been lost from the Christian perspective. But pretty much, this is the way culture is going to be, and we're going to have to be learning to be very prudent as to how we deal with this new view of reality. It's not reality, but it's a new way to view reality. And so let me remind us that this is not the first time this has happened. This is not the first generation that's had to deal with these kinds of ideas, in particular challenges towards the biblical concept of marriage. I was reading, I left it down on the first row, but I was reading an article this week. I've had the magazine for I just happened to look through it, it's called the World's Greatest Empires. And it's just sort of a history of the greatest, most influential empires in the history of the world to this point. And so you begin, of course, with Babylon. I think we have some pictures here. Begin with Babylon, and here this great symbol of Babylon was the winged lion, the power and the speed of that culture. And then the next we have is Greece. Here we have the Parthenon, and you have the wisdom and the influence of Greek to this day, of Greek culture to this day still influences much of Western culture. And then we have Rome. See the Colosseum here, and the Colosseum, that great place where the gladiatorial fights were waged, and Rome extended its influence for 1,000 years. The greatest power on earth. And then maybe more recently, some of you will remember the Soviet Union, the Union of Soviet Socialized Republics, USSR, and as they spread out all through over Europe and Asia, this is in Kyrgyzstan, I believe, and they would not only conquer the oppressed peoples, they would then erect these large statues saying, here's the way the world really looks, and it really works, as Lenin said, it would really work. And what do all four of those kingdoms have in common? They're all gone. Most powerful kingdoms in the world, and they're all gone. The other thing they have in common is all four overtly, purposely, at the governmental level, oppose God's people. Babylon, or Greece, or Rome, or the Soviet Union. Here's what I'd say to us as believers who take seriously that gender is something that reflects God's character and His image in our lives. Some of us who take marriage very seriously and recognize, while not perfect, it is a reflection of God's covenant love for us. And we live in a culture where there are pretty much open ideas about those issues. What do? I would say this: never underestimate the power of the gospel to change lives. Never fear or despair or rage or feel like we have to somehow bow to the pressure of culture when we recognize the gospel has the power not only to change lives, the gospel has the power to change history. So maybe the first thing I would say to us as we think about marriage, how as a believer should I think about marriage? I would say this: God's people are to model marriages that are fundamentally different than the world around us. God's people are to model marriages that are fundamentally different from the world around us. We are not the first generation that this is the case. In fact, you don't have to turn there, but let me read to you from Leviticus chapter 18. Leviticus chapter 18 is an extended treatment of how do families relate to one another. And the context is, you are now the redeemed people of God. You have been set free from slavery in Egypt. You have passed through the Red Sea. You are ready to go into the promised land and engage a culture that is very hostile to you. How do you live? Listen, listen, listen. You shall not do as they do in the land of Egypt where you lived. And you shall not do as they do in the land of Canaan to which I am bringing you. You shall not walk in their statutes. It's always been the case that culture is going to have different, varying, and changing ideas of things like gender, or things like how we treat races, or things like marriage, or relationships, all of those things. And you and I are simply not to be part of that. We don't have to embrace that. We don't really even have to fight that. We don't have to walk in that way. What we are called to do, and I love how it always relates to the personal God who redeemed us. I am the Lord your God. You shall follow my rules and keep my statutes and walk in them. I am the Lord your God. And again, that personal covenant-keeping name of God. I redeemed you. I created you. I have made you mine. I have given you these rules for your good. And so just walk in those ways. And so I would encourage us today, stand up, be politically active as much as you want to. Do all that you can and should. We live in a wonderful country where political activism is a great thing. But at the end of the day, what we want to model is graciousness and truth for a culture around us who has no compass morally anymore to determine right from wrong. And so the people of God, we are called to model marriages that are fundamentally different than the world around us. What does that look like? What is a relationship that is fundamentally different going to look like? How can I, in my marriage, whether I'm newlywed, middle of my marriage, many years, or I'm going to be married here coming up, what are the ways to model that kind of marriage? Let me give us 3 things to think about. Genesis chapter 2. The first thing is this: build on the right foundation. Build on the right foundation. If you're single here today, take good notes. If you're single and you're an adult, every date is a potential mate. And so think about this. So much better to be able to have some standards and go into a relationship knowing where you stand on these things than having been married and then realizing later on, wow, we didn't get the right foundation laid. Some of you, maybe only a few, are called to what is a gift. 1 Corinthians chapter 7 calls it a gift, the gift of singleness. And so for some of you, you say, you know what, Scott, I'm not anxious about this. I am content where I am single. To you, I say there's some very basic truths about the way relationships work you'll learn through this message, but mostly I say to you, God bless you. Go in the strength of that singleness, leverage all of the gifts that you have for the kingdom of God, the growth of the gospel, and the good of others. But for those of us that are married, soon to be, build on the right foundation. Now, Genesis chapter 2. You recognize how often in this family series we find ourselves in Genesis? Because God created us in His image. relationship reflects that God has relationship with himself, the Father, the Son, the Spirit. There's sweet fellowship there. And so you and I are designed to be in relationship, the most intimate of which is marriage. Genesis 2:23, we find ourselves in the garden. God has created man. God has created woman. He presents the woman to Adam. It's as though a father giving away the bride, that kind of a thing. And here we have the foundation for the marriage relationship. It's quoted throughout the New Testament. Chapter 2, verse 23. And the man said, "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh." There's a level of intimacy. There's a level of similarity. We are the same thing, human beings. She should be called woman because she was taken out of man. And yet there's a complementarianism. There is a sense in which we are different but better together. 24. Here's the exclusivity of marriage. A man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast, be united, cleave to, cling to. The word would be to alloy together as two metals are heated and alloyed together in a permanent union. That's the idea. He shall hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Speaking of unity, but also of sexuality. This is one of the purposes of marriage. And the man and his wife were both naked, and they were not ashamed. There's a freedom, there's an honesty. This was a big deal in the ancient world with shame, and here we have someone totally free with someone else they love. And build on the right foundation. What is that? Scott, help us understand what might that foundation look like in marriage. It would look like three things at least. One, marriage is to be exclusive, permanent, and for our good. Marriage is to be exclusive, permanent, and for our good. Exclusivity speaks of the fact that it's one man and one woman married. Now let me wade right into it up front. Some of you, I recognize, are on second marriages or third marriages. Some of you have felt the sting, the pain, the devastation of having someone walk out or someone break that relationship. Or maybe someone died and you've been heartbroken in that, and you have found restoration in a second marriage. I would say to you all the more, you know the pain of divorce or of loss, and your marriage is to be exclusive. We are committed to one another. When we stood before God and those assembled witnesses and said, "I do," we gave up our right to pursue whatever path we wanted. Marriage is to be exclusive. Marriage is to be permanent. We'll talk about that a little more near the end. But there is that sense of, I am in this thing, I am committed to this thing, and we are going to go through this. Not sure what, we're going to go through it together. And then it is to be for our good. And that's where I want to land for a little bit. God identified a problem. It's not good for man to be alone. And I will make a suitable helper for him, someone that corresponds precisely to their needs. And so God created man, and a woman meets that need, and God created a woman, and man perfectly meets that need. And that's the design. It says God intended it. And so there's that sense of for our good. And yet the reality is, if we're honest, we face problems in marriage. Even the best of marriages face problems. In my own life, and certainly in my experiences, I've counseled many couples, both pre and after marriage. I've just sort of broadly grouped these problems into three categories, and I'm focusing primarily on marriage issues now. People tend to have the problem of distraction, problems of distraction. What I mean by distraction is we're very busy. Everybody, I'm busy, I'm really busy, and I've got career and work and soccer and baseball and basketball, and I've got golf, and I've got lots of things, and I'm busy. And what happens is we allow ourselves to be so busy, we're distracted, and find in the most important relationship we have, husband to wife, wife to husband, we don't have the time, the energy, or the best of ourselves left to really invest in them. So I think a helpful strategy would be the big rocks in the river. You know that saying? If you're on our staff, you know that. We use that a lot when it comes to scheduling. What we say is put the big rocks in the river first, and the river of schedule flows around that. Sunday morning's a big rock in the river. Whatever you're going to do, don't do it on Sunday morning. It's for staff. Like, we're on. Or Tuesday morning staff meeting. All right, whatever your week holds, don't schedule appointments at that time on Tuesday morning. And so I would say to us, one of the ways we can overcome this problem of distraction, I'm doing lots of things. Am I doing the best things? is to put some big rocks in the river of your calendar. I'm going to give my spouse this time. It's a Friday night for dates. Or for us, Sunday night happens to fall because my Sunday night is your Friday night, right? And when do I have time exclusively? When I'm at my best. I'm not flustered and frustrated and fatigued. Distraction is a problem. Another problem is resentment. Perhaps it grows out of the first problem. But often we can find ourselves a few years, maybe decades into this marriage, that person we held hands and we got sweaty palms, we were so giddy with them, and we exchanged rings, and they bother me. And it's cool, maybe cold is the word in the home. It's resentment. We begin to question motives. They did that on purpose. Well, in rare cases, maybe they did, but maybe I'm seeing them now through a lens of resentment, and everything they do I sort of chalk up to trying to irritate me. That takes us to a bad place. That's the wood being rotten, and you haven't even seen it yet. And then the third thing we would find, there are issues that distract us, there are issues that can hurt us and just sort of make us resentful. We can face the problem of disaster. I mean, God willing, this is only a few. But some marriages face really heavy water. Someone breaks a covenantal vow. It's a crushing burden to bear. God forbid, but a child dies. A business goes bankrupt. Somebody does prison time. It's hard. It's heartbreaking. And unfortunately, those kind of life-altering experiences are so often followed by divorce a few years later. So build on the right foundation. Recognize we're going to have, even in the best of situations, difficulty. And then let's talk about the second thing. Let's do the little things well. Let's get the little things right. Very practical, just these last few minutes. How can I get the little things right? Now let me anticipate an objection that's going to come up right now in some of your minds. Some of you are going to say, Scott, I don't think you recognize how serious our problems are. She's not willing to work on it. Or he's not willing to put the time and effort in you just talked about. And what I'm about to do for you is talk about a series of little things. They won't cost you anything. They're not difficult. And I believe they'll make a tremendous difference in turning the dial up on the warmth in your relationship. So you're going to be thinking, you know what? This is all fine and good. It's like Boy Scout stuff. Won't work for us. We're too far gone. Let me say this. First of all, it won't hurt. Won't hurt. Secondly, what you may find is that in these disciplines or practices we're about to go through, you may find the tension level beginning to lower, the resentment level beginning to lower to the point that you can actually have honest, at times painful conversations about hard things. And you will never have those conversations when the resentment level and the anger level is this high. So go on my faith, if you don't have your own faith about these things, that I do believe this will make a significant difference in every marriage, including those who are the most difficult of places. Now let's take a look at the New Testament, Colossians chapter 3. Colossians chapter 3. Get the little things right. And in Colossians 3, we have, interestingly enough, the context is how do I relate to others as a believer? And it begins with my own personal relationship with others, and then it goes to the family. So while we're going to read verses 12 through 17, beginning of verse 18 for an entire chapter, deals with family relationships. So that's the context. Colossians 3, 12 through 17 is the verse that I most often recommend. If somebody says, hey, Pastor Scott, at our wedding, we'd like to read some verses, what would you suggest? This is where I go. I will say when I was younger, first starting on ministry, I didn't go here. I went with the 1 Corinthians 13, love is patient, love is kind, which is great. But having been married for a long time and having dealt with many married couples, I just realized there's a lot of value in the truth of Colossians chapter 3, verse 12. Put on then as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved. Isn't it interesting how behavior grows out of our identity? We are chosen by God. We are beloved by Him. We are holy. Based on that relationship, we begin to act a certain way. Well, how do we act? Put on then as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience, bearing with one another, and if one has a complaint against another, forgiving each other, as the Lord has forgiven you, so you must also forgive. And above all these, put on love, which binds them all together in perfect harmony. Now, the next verse is really important to me because I think we often aim for the wrong thing. Will you please bury the idea of happily ever after? Does not work even in fairy tales. And it for sure doesn't work in the real world in which we live. So verse 15, let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you were called. What were we called? To be at peace. And it's the peace of Christ who made peace with God, and now with which we have the power to have peace with one another. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you were called in one body, and be thankful. I would hold out to us that the goal of marriage is not to be happy. The goal of marriage is that we would have peace. Because if you set the goal to be happy all the time, first of all, that's a false goal. Secondly, you'll never do that. And at times when we have had situations that didn't make me happy in our marriage, I can tell you what, we've been at peace though. And so redefine what you're aiming for. Get the little things right. What do you mean, Scott? How can you be specific here? Well, let's looking through the list. How about this? Be kind. Come on, that's so simple. Yeah, try it for a while. It's not so simple. Be kind. Courtesy. Gentleness. Treating others with a deep sense of respect and kindness. That should begin in the home. Speak well. A little exercise here. Let's just fast forward. Let's rewind, I should say. Let's just rewind to, say, Monday morning. We're getting ready. We're getting dressed. We're going to head out the door, get the kids to school, and we're going off to the office. And then let's land it today. Here it is. It's noon now here in our world. For the last 7 days, how did the conversations with your spouse go? What were the nature of the conversations? What kind of words got said? What kind of attitude was freighted in those words? How much building up, how much tearing down? Just think specifically about the last week. Don't think about 20 years ago. I love Proverbs chapter 12 and verse 18. I know this in the NIV, and so I'm going to quote it to you in NIV, but it's so true. Reckless words pierce like a sword, but the tongue of the wise brings healing. If you didn't get the reference, it's Proverbs 12:18. Reckless words pierce like a sword. They hurt. They leave scars. They cause pain. They build calluses. And if we're the kind of person that says, you know what, I can just outdo my spouse in the home, that's a reckless act. If my goal is to shred them, I'm acting foolishly. I'm playing the fool. So the tongue of the wise brings healing. In any given exchange in the home, here's the question, and listen, there are going to be warm disagreements. I totally get that. They're going to be locked down in your corner. This is what I think, this is what you think. But the evaluation of if I handle that wisely is simply this. At the end of that little set to, did we find healing? Or did we bring ruin? There are times you have to open it up. There are times you have to get rid of that rotten wood underneath. There are times you have to say hard things. But the tongue of the wise brings healing even in the most difficult of circumstances. How do we use our words to those who are the closest to us? I can tell you, I have personally witnessed people who are saying things to their spouse that if they said it at their office, they'd be in the HR department an hour later. Be kind, speak well. 3, believe the best. That's a discipline. That's a mental discipline. You may have to have a lot of conversation in your own heart and mind saying, you know what? He didn't mean it that way. She's not doing that just to irritate me. She just doesn't understand when it's 4th down, no time left on the clock. And honestly, if you say, you know what, I know it's intentional, then why not have that conversation? Kindly, gently, but honestly. Be kind, speak well, believe the best. 4th, pursue God together. This seems so simplistic, but do you know the statistics? You probably don't. The statistics on those who attend gospel preaching churches versus those who don't. I mean, the divorce rate is like 1/3. It's an amazingly healthy thing, and that's just the empirical evidence. I'm saying to us, just do it because it's the right thing. And worship together and pray with your spouse. Listen, I'm married and I'm a preacher. It's still hard to pray with my spouse. She knows what I'm faking. I can't put on the preacher voice with her. Irritates her anyway. Serve together. One of the disciplines we put in place years and years and years ago, knowing ministry it's demanding, is we serve together. So when I was student pastor or pastor to students, Vicki served in the student ministry. And in Melrose Park, the small little, turnaround church, she served in virtually everything. And we're in small groups together here, and she serves with me in the ways that I serve. And it's just a practical way, as busy as life is, to say, we're going to serve God together. And 5th thing I would say is serve one another. Serve one another. Shortly before he was crucified, in fact, it was on his way to Jerusalem, Jesus had gathered the guys together, 12 disciples together, and an argument broke out with them. And the argument was about this: who's the greatest? You can see it in Matthew 20 if you want to turn there. Matthew 20. Who's the greatest? And they just argued. And 2 of them, James and John, said, we think we're the greatest, and we want to get the promotion to the right hand and to the left. And Jesus is watching this nonsense, knowing he's going to be dying in a week. You know what he said? Verse 28. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. The greatest among you will be the servant of all. Import that into the marriage relationship. It's so counterintuitive. It's such a truth that we don't normally get. My deepest, highest satisfaction in my relationship is going to correspond to how seriously I pursue my wife's happiness. And wives, you will find a truism to be that the more I pursue my husband's true joy in a God-like love for him, a covenant-based love for him, I will find my joy and satisfaction rising. Build on the right foundation, get the little things right. 3rd, commit. Commit. Do you remember? Do you remember when you stood before the preacher and the assembled witnesses in the church? For me, it was June 15th, 1984. 31 2/3 of a year ago, or however long it is. I'll remember June 15th when the time comes, and so. It's Friday night, it was 7 o'clock. The preacher was late for the wedding. How about that? I was already nervous as a cat. I almost didn't make it, There was no window in that little room where I was waiting, and so. Why don't we show the next slide here? Young kid, I was still in college when I got married. The preacher, in front of all those people in that room, big old traditional looking church, asked me these questions. Do you promise to be to her a faithful husband and forsaking all others, keep only to her as long as you shall live? I had to think about that. That's a big question. and I made a commitment. You know what I said? What did I say? I do. And then they did this. Put up the next series of slides. Too warm in here. I can't get the ring off. So there's the, there it is. So there's the exchange of the rings. After you do the vows, the exchange of the rings. And hands are sweaty, and you're like, can I get this ring on? And then I said these words, I, Scott, take you, Vicki, to be my wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward. Now look at the next series of phrases. It covers it all, man. It covers our lives. For better, for worse. For richer, for poorer. In sickness and in health. To love and to cherish. Talk about permanence. Till death do us part. She did not know, and I did not know at that moment that we would fight the battle with infertility. She did not know, and I did not know that we would adopt cross-racial lines and all the challenges that come with that, especially 25 years ago. She did not know, and I did not know that 10 years or so into marriage, we would be called to leave the home we grew up in, the family we grew up in, the neighborhood that we grew up in, where her parents still live and where my parents are buried, and come to Chicago. Now, when you're from Mishawaka, Indiana, Chicago is like the scariest thing out there. I've told you before, my dad's only thing was like, Scott, they have one-way streets there. Oh, it's like, Dad, if you only knew what they got there. So we didn't know that my mom would get cancer, live in our home until she died. Vicki didn't know that 3 a.m. she would be up caring for my mom as my mom had some problems that comes near the end of life. I didn't know that my uncle would give us the gift of 4 years in our home. We didn't know that Vicki would deal with cancer last year. And I don't know what tomorrow or next year or the year after that brings. But I do know that I made a commitment, and so did she. And when I say to us commit, I say that having been through some things in life. I don't take that lightly. And I recognize you are going through really deep water in your life, perhaps right now. And what I'm saying is not that marriage, if we get through this, will be okay. I'm saying we will get through this because we're committed to that vow. Bow your heads and close your eyes with me. I want to give you just 30 seconds or so to give some thought to reaffirming your commitment to your spouse. Those things which trouble you, they're not unimportant, but they're secondary to the vows we made. Now I want to lead us in a prayer, and if you're here with your spouse, maybe it's time to join hands and just sort of recommit. Heavenly Father, thank you for your love for us. Always and only that is the source of relationship. Father, help us to model in our own lives the love for our spouse that is based on your love for us. Selfless, sacrificial, long-lasting, giving. Father, wherever we find ourselves, things going along great, just so-so, or maybe really in deep water right now, I pray that we would be totally committed to this marriage, reaffirming the vows we took years or decades ago, that while our life circumstances may have changed dramatically, nothing about our commitment to one another has changed. Dear God, I pray for your hope, for your power to change people who are deeply frustrated right now. God, that they would just trust that you can transform. Thank you, Lord, for your love for us. Help us to model it to those closest to us, I pray. And I ask this in Jesus' name. And all God's people agreed by saying, amen.